In Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, the disciples asked Jesus, "When shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?" After describing a number of events during his discourses, both during the day at the temple and on the Mount of Olives later that night, Jesus described the cataclysmic events that would occur during the time of his second coming. In Matthew, Jesus states, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heaven shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds from one end of heaven to the other." Mark 13:24 through 25 and Luke 21:25 are similar to this passage in Matthew 24:29. Matthew and Mark both describe the sun being darkened, the moon not giving her light, and the stars falling from heaven. But Luke summarizes them in Luke 21:25 with, "And there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars." Then Luke 21:26 inserts additional information not described in Matthew or Mark. "Upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear for looking after those things which are coming on the earth." Next, all three of them say something similar to, "And the powers of the heavens shall be shaken." Matthew gives information not included by Mark or Luke. "Then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven." But the next phrase, "all the tribes of the earth mourn," is similar to what Luke describes as the fear and distress of those on earth. Then all three state, "They shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." Matthew and Mark then state similar things. "He shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet. They shall gather together his elect from the four winds from one end of heaven to the other." This all culminates in Luke stating, "When these things begin, then look up, lift up your heads, your redemption draweth nigh." These events are clearly the final cataclysmic events as indicated by the word immediately and the prepositional phrase after the tribulation of those days in the Matthew passage. Immediately is translated from the Greek adverb eutheos, which means straightway, immediately, and forthwith. After is translated from the Greek preposition meta, which can mean with, after, or behind, depending on its Greek case, dative, genitive, or accusative. With or behind obviously have different meanings in English than after, however the Greek grammar comes to the rescue. The preposition meta means after when it is followed by a direct object otherwise known as the accusative case in Greek. In this verse, the noun thalipsis, meaning tribulation, is the object of the preposition meta and is in the accusative case, so after is the correct meaning. The timing of Matthew along with other related passages is well established by the information presented. These events occur at the very end of the 70th week of Daniel. Additional passages that describe the final cataclysmic events are found in Revelation 16, Isaiah chapters 13, 24, and 34, and Joel chapters 2 and 3. The prevailing view for the timing of another passage, Revelation 6, 12 through 17, is that it occurs in the middle of the 70th week of Daniel, not at the end. However, a closer examination of the details in all of these passages reveals that it is describing the same final cataclysmic events. We will be building this table as we go along. The first column lists the 14 cataclysmic events described by the 7 scripture passages that we are going to review, which are listed across the top of the table. Although the heading lists Matthew 24, it also includes the information from Mark 13 and Luke 21. These passages describe 5 things from the list. The description, "Day of the wrath has come, who shall abide," is the wording from later passages we will be looking at. However, what Luke and Matthew describe regarding the fear and mourning of the people on earth could possibly refer to the same thing. That should become clearer as we go along. Just as Matthew, Mark, and Luke describe an earthquake or a great shaking, Revelation 16, 18 through 21 also describes this in more detail. And there were voices and thunders and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake and so great. And the great city Jerusalem was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And great Babylon came in remembrance before God, to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. The timing of the destruction of Babylon is one key event for determining the timing of the other passages we will be examining. Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum has done extensive research into the final events at the end of the tribulation. He calls it the Armageddon Campaign. These events occur in the final days of the tribulation. In it, he confirms that the destruction of Babylon occurs at the end of the tribulation during stage 2. Continuing on in Revelation 16, verse 20, "And every island fled away, and the mountains were not found." This would result in a change in the topography of the entire earth. Verse 21, "And there fell upon men a great hail out of heaven, every stone about the weight of a talent. And men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, for the plague thereof was exceedingly great." The timing of this passage is at the end of the tribulation, right before the second coming of Christ, which occurs in chapter 19, for the following 2 reasons. Revelation 15:1 indicates that the 7 last plagues, of which Revelation 16:18 through 21 is the 7th plague, complete the wrath of God. Revelation 16:17, which occurs right after the 7th plague, states, "It is done." Revelation 15:1 says, "And I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels having the 7 last plagues, for in them is filled up the wrath of God." The word last is translated from the Greek word eschatos, which means extreme, last in a temporal succession. The Greek word translated filled up is teleo, which means to perform, execute, complete, fulfill, to do just as commanded, and generally involving the notion of time. Revelation 16:17 states, "And the 7th angel poured out his vial into the air, and there came a great voice out of the temple of heaven from the throne, saying, It is done." The phrase "it is done" is translated from the Greek verb ginomai, to become, come to pass. It is in the perfect tense, which means it is a completed action with ongoing results. So Revelation 16 gives us 3 more details regarding this final event. The next passage we are going to look at is Isaiah 34, 4 through 8. "And all the hosts of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll, and all their hosts shall fall down as the leaf falleth off from the vine, and as a falling fig from a fig tree." A key event described in Isaiah 34, 5 through 8 is the sacrifice in Bozrah that is also referred to in Isaiah 63, 1 through 6. Isaiah 34, 5 through 8. "For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Behold, it shall come down upon Idumea, and upon the people of my curse. The Lord hath a sacrifice in Bozrah, for it is the day of the Lord's vengeance." Dr. Fruchtenbaum also confirms that this sacrifice in Bozrah occurs at the second coming. It is listed as stages 6 and 7. The timing of this passage is the end of the 70th week of Daniel, as indicated by the context, which includes the appointment in Bozrah. So Isaiah 34 now has added 3 new details and matches up with 1. The entire chapter of Isaiah 13 is concerning the destruction of Babylon. Verse 13:9 indicates that it is during the day of the Lord, and verses 12 through 13 give familiar details. "Stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened. The moon shall not cause her light to shine. The Lord will shake the heavens, and the earth will move out of her place." Since the destruction of the city of Babylon happens at the end of the tribulation, this places these cataclysmic events also at the same time as Matthew 24 and Revelation 16. From the passages we have just studied, 4 things agree with Matthew 24, and it adds 2 new ones. The stars withdraw their shining, and the earth removes out of her place, which sounds like the earth being knocked off her axis. The next passage is Isaiah 24, which describes the final judgment upon the earth itself. Isaiah chapters 24 through 27 is called the Little Apocalypse. Dr. Norman Geisler, in his 4-volume work Systematic Theology, states, "Isaiah's little apocalypse fits John's description in Revelation 19 through 21. Isaiah 24 is a prediction of the day of the Lord that resembles John's expanded version in Revelation 6 through 19. Chapter 24 is a very long chapter that we don't have time to read, but here are the events that stand out and correspond to the cataclysmic events chart. Behold, the Lord maketh the earth empty, and maketh it waste, and turneth it upside down, and scattereth abroad the inhabitants thereof. Turneth it upside down is translated from two Hebrew words, avah and panim, which is an odd translation. Turneth it is translated from the Hebrew word avah, which means to twist or distort. For some reason, upside down is translated from panim, which means face. The two Hebrew words together literally mean to distort its surface, which would imply changing the earth's topography. Verse 19. The earth is utterly broken down, the earth is clean dissolved, the earth is moved exceedingly. The words clean dissolved is translated from the Hebrew verb parar, that means to break to bits or shatter. The words moved exceedingly are translated from the Hebrew verb mot, and means to be greatly shaken. The Hebrew words parar and mot are actually used 2 times in succession for emphasis as to the greatness of the breaking apart and of the shaking. Although the following events aren't part of our cataclysmic events chart, they are important to the timing of the events. Chapter 24, verses 21 through 22, ends with a description that Dr. Geisler believes parallels the events in Revelation. When Christ returns, he will punish the devil and his emissaries, imprisoning Satan. After many days, the millennium, there will be a punishment of the wicked before the white throne judgment. So the judgment and destruction of the earth described in Isaiah 24 occurs at the second coming and before the beginning of the millennium. This passage agrees with 3 items and speaks of the earth being dissolved. The next passage is Joel 2:10 through 11. The earth shall quake before them, the heavens shall tremble, the sun and the moon shall be dark, and the stars shall withdraw their shining. And the Lord shall utter his voice before his army, for his camp is very great, for he is strong that executeth his word. For the day of the Lord is great and very terrible, and who can abide it? The day that it is speaking of is the day of the Lord. The timing of Joel 2:10 through 11 is established by the indication that it is during the day of the Lord. Also, when compared to the details described in the passages that are clearly at the end of the 70th week of Daniel, these details line up. The Joel 2 passage agrees with 6 of the items on our chart and doesn't add any additional events. The next passage is Joel 3:15 through 16. The sun and the moon shall be darkened, and the stars shall withdraw their shining. The Lord also shall roar out of Zion, and utter his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth shall shake. Joel chapter 3 begins with a judgment on the nations in verse 1. This judgment on the nations occurs after the tribulation in preparation for the millennial kingdom. In the verses before verse 15, it talks about the multitudes in the Valley of Decision, which is earlier named as the Valley of Jehoshaphat. This is something Jesus will do at his second coming. For there will I sit to judge all the heathen round about. Joel 3 has the same descriptions as Joel 2, but it doesn't include day of wrath has come, who can abide. There is debate about when Revelation 6:12 through 17 occurs. Does it occur somewhere in the middle of the tribulation, or does it occur at the end of the 70th week of Daniel, right before or during the second coming of Christ? I think you will find that many of the details described in Revelation 6:12 through 17 will be very familiar to you, especially those in red, which seem to be quoting Isaiah 34:4, which we discussed earlier. And I beheld when he had opened the 6th seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. And the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs, when she is shaken of a mighty wind. And the heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. And the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every free man, hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, Fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand? Up until now, Isaiah 13 matched up with the most details. Let's take a look at Revelation 6:12 through 17. It matches up to 9 of the details described in the other passages, including the day of wrath has come, who will stand or abide. The fact that Revelation 6:12 through 17 matches up with so many of the details that are contained in the passages, which are clearly describing the final cataclysmic events, this supports the likelihood that it is also referring to the final cataclysmic events which will occur at the second coming of Jesus Christ. So as Peter states, "Seeing then that all these things shall be dissolved, what manner of persons ought we to be in holy conversation and godliness?"